Good afternoon, everyone. Don Parry here. I'm hosting the webinar in the Community in Transition webinar series about carbon farming today. Carbon farming, the business case. This is topic 4 of the series, and today I have 3 presenters here with me. And they'll speak for 40 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes Q&A. If you have any questions along the journey of the webinar, please click on your Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and enter your questions. All the questions will be answered at the end, but when you think of them, put them in, please. So from the department, we have Megan Surawski, Don Butler, and from Bundaberg, we have Mark Lincoln, who works in private practice in this area. So welcome to you all, Megan, Don and Mark, and I'll hand over to Megan and Don to start today.
Thank you, Don. Thank you all for attending the webinar. We will quickly introduce ourselves again. I'm Megan Surawski. I head up the Land Restoration Fund unit within the Department of Environment and Science. And with me is Dr. Don Butler, who is the Chief Scientific Officer for the team. And Don, you can say a few words about yourself.
Hello, everyone. My background, I'm a landscape ecologist who's worked for a long time in spatial data for Queensland on biodiversity.
So we might just make a dive straight into our presentation today, because we could phrase this by saying we're from the government and we're here to help, but that's actually not what we're here for today. We're here to give you a quick introduction to carbon farming and what we're doing with the Land Restoration Fund. So here we go. Over to Don.
Happy for me to do most of the talking. So we are going to initially cover this topic about what carbon farming is, give you a broad sense of what falls under that umbrella, and then Mark will talk more about the specifics of particular business cases around vegetation-based carbon projects primarily. So carbon farming is actually a little bit of a misleading term in the sense that it gives you a narrow sense. It's where carbon farming started. It's actually a label that refers to the whole carbon offsetting scheme for Australia, which is something that's managed by the Commonwealth Government. The reason that it's still called carbon farming is that the act that it actually swings off is called the Carbon Farming Initiative Act. The carbon farming framework for Australia uses this credit called an Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which some people refer to as ACCUs. They're a financial product. As a financial product, people who give you advice about the financial side of managing ACCUs need to have an Australian Financial Services licence, and you should be seeking the normal sorts of advice that you seek whenever you take business decisions around ACCUs and carbon farming from your accountants and bank managers and the like.
And lawyers.
And lawyers.
And lawyers, yeah.
So an ACCU is equivalent to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide either avoided from emissions or stored in the landscape. As I said, the ACCU is something that's controlled by the Carbon Farming Initiative Act, which is a Commonwealth Act, and began in 2011. That act has continued to work despite the comings and goings of various governments and even more prime ministers since that time. The Carbon Farming Initiative Act still underpins what became known as the Emissions Reduction Fund. That transition happened in 2015, and at that time the carbon farming framework was expanded to include a lot of industrial activities, which I'll touch on a little bit further. And it also changed then to go from just a mechanism that enabled landholders to earn carbon credits into this broader fund concept, as the Emissions Reduction Fund name indicates, where the Commonwealth became the major purchaser of Australian carbon credit units. And that doesn't mean that other people aren't purchasing ACCUs, and it doesn't mean that people with projects have to sell to the Commonwealth Government and the Emissions Reduction Fund. So the fund has both a crediting side as well as a purchasing side, and they're two quite distinct components of the fund. Now, following the Commonwealth election in 2019, we've got this new name floated around, the Climate Solutions Fund. And there's some talk about some change to the overall working of the Emissions Reduction Fund. So far, everything's still badged as the Emissions Reduction Fund. And I hope that through this presentation, we'll give you some sense that it's highly likely that the ACCU and the underlying carbon farming legislation, no matter what name it says on the headline, will continue to work in much the same ways, despite the changing names and changing colours of government. So as I said, the Emissions Reduction Fund carbon farming framework, it's all administered by the Commonwealth. And there are three major bodies that do that administration. There's the Department of Environment and Energy, which is responsible primarily for the policy side and kind of overseeing the development of these things called methods. So to participate in the Emissions Reduction Fund and carbon farming, the first thing you need to do is identify a method that's available under the Emissions Reduction Fund that fits your activity. And each method specifies eligibility criteria and all the things you have to satisfy to be able to run a project to earn ACCUs. The central box there, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to pick up on a little bit there with the method piece. Is the method just is like a formula? It's a bit like a recipe. It is not only does it outline whether you can do a carbon farming project, but it also tells you how to do it and what the rules are for generating those units. As Don highlighted earlier, these are highly regulated instruments, and there's, as a consequence, quite tight rules around what you do, how you do it. I just note on that slide before Don moves on to the second column that there's assurance via something called the ERAC, and that's the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, which also is another layer to make sure that Australia's Australian carbon credit units are verifiable and absolutely, people aren't paying for, they are actually paying for something as opposed to simply paying a feel-good piece of money, if that makes sense.
So the word we use is integrity.
Yeah, integrity.
So the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee evolved from another committee back in time that had integrity in its name, which actually reflected what they did better. So the second box there, the Clean Energy Regulator, is really the most important in my mind of the three agencies, and that's the one that I would suggest you, if you're interested in carbon farming, you have the most direct contact with. They administer the fund, they basically register projects, they run the auctions for project proponents to sell the credits that they've earned to the Commonwealth, and they're in charge of compliance, market regulation and development. And then the third box, they're essentially a review entity, the Climate Change Authority. So they're pitching in advice periodically to ensure that the integrity of the whole framework is sound. So as that last slide, the previous slides indicated, this framework's been around for some time now, 8 years, and it's already seen a lot of uptake. So if you go to the bottom of the ACCUs issued column there, you can see that there have been over 66 million Australian carbon credit units issued by the Clean Energy Regulator to nearly 800 projects Australia-wide. There's a column there for the number of projects in Queensland. We have 274 of the country's 788 projects. The other thing I really want to highlight with this slide is that there are lots of different types of methods. So that left-hand column, I've ordered these in order of the number of projects registered. So you can see that vegetation, which is a very broad banner, including environmental plantings, forestry methods, human-induced regeneration type projects, which Mark will talk a bit more about. There we've got more than half of the projects and more than half of the credits issued under that theme. But there's also a lot of activity under waste, so that's where councils and others who own landfill can take the methane that's coming off of those landfill sites, burn it so that it converts into a less potent greenhouse gas in carbon dioxide and earn carbon credits as a result. And there are also alternative waste treatment methods there. So things like organic waste can be treated differently to earn carbon credits. Savanna burning is the next, but it goes all the way down through to transport facilities. So the carbon farming label, as I mentioned at the start, is a little bit misleading in the sense that it's a banner that's applied to a much broader entity. So having recognised that, I'm now going to ignore it to some extent, because at the Land Restoration Fund and in Mark's company as well, we're most interested in where carbon farming started, which is basically a change in land management to increase the carbon stored in the landscape and or to avoid emissions of greenhouse gases.
Associated with land management practices.
Yeah. So the Land Restoration Fund, just to give a bit of a background on that, is a Queensland government initiative that was promised in the last state election, where we'll take $500 million and look to build a pipeline of Queensland-based carbon offset projects focused on those land sector methods covered by vegetation and savanna burning primarily, but also potentially soil carbon and beef herd management and the like under the agricultural banner, to pursue environmental and economic co-benefits, which are basically is a way of saying that we're interested in using carbon farming as a way to deliver other goods that reflect the state's interests. So I've got a box there that says that co-benefits are outcomes from carbon projects that aren't carbon, essentially. We're particularly interested under this government in projects that will benefit the Great Barrier Reef, benefit biodiversity, benefit regional communities, including traditional owner economies. And the other thing we're doing, as well as trying to build a pipeline of carbon projects, is support research and development. So this is where we're looking to help the Commonwealth make the carbon farming initiative a better thing to deliver the types of outcomes we're interested in.
So some of those priorities in terms of supporting that work is around blue carbon, which is the carbon that's either stored or avoided through management of coastal ecosystems. Nitrogen use efficiency in irrigated agriculture, and avoided clearing. So making sure that the avoided clearing method is improved and relevant to particularly Queensland landholders.
So broadly, if you take that diagram on the right of this slide, you can see that the carbon farming project as a concept, and this is something that, as the previous slides have shown, the existing emissions reduction fund has been effective in delivering a lot of projects across the country. But those carbon farming projects can deliver a whole lot of other values, and there's some there in terms of the economic benefits, and that's the business case that we're talking about here today for landholders. But there's also, through the change land management to store carbon in the land, you're improving a lot of the time the system for biodiversity, you're making benefits to water quality and the like, and then there's the community that wraps around that. So the idea of the Land Restoration Fund is that we will effectively pay a bit more for ACCUs from projects that deliver more of those other goods, the co-benefits. Now, the reason Queensland has a keen interest in carbon farming, it's not just that it can deliver those other outcomes, but it's also because when you look at the nation, as these maps here are from a CSIRO National Outlook report published in 2015, when you take a look at the whole of Australia, Queensland tends to stand out as a place that's well suited to storing more carbon in our landscape. So the bottom pictures here are basically showing blue areas where economically we can expect financial benefit from a transition to store more carbon in those lands, with the maps being different abatement scenarios, so basically different price signals, with the moderate abatement M2 map on the right being a fairly moderate price for carbon, crossing to the left where you're expecting to see more high prices for carbon. And you can see that under low prices, Queensland's just about the only place we're expecting to see a widespread transition, and as the price goes up, you get more options further south. And that's kind of reflected in the existing reality of the projects that are already registered under the Emissions Reduction Fund. There's a lot of them in Queensland. And we've done other work here in the state government with consulting partners like Energetics to get a sense of the likely future and our potential role as a state government in supporting as effective and beneficial outcome for Queensland as we can expect. There are 3 there that you can find online, and there are links elsewhere in this presentation to those. The sort of headline number that Energetics delivered to us was essentially to say that carbon farming currently is worth, we've got contracts from Queensland projects to the Emissions Reduction Fund worth upwards of $800 million, nearly $1 billion worth of contracts for ACCUs. With the right sort of conditions, new methods being developed, an improved price on carbon and those sorts of things, we can expect to see up to around $8 billion worth of value to the Queensland economy to 2030, if conditions are right. And one of the things you tend to hear about, because carbon farming is associated with the debate around climate change policy, is policy uncertainty. And this slide's really just a bit of a point towards some of the bigger forces, even bigger than Australia's climate policy, that make it likely that carbon offsets and the Australian Carbon Credit Unit as part of that picture will be an important part of our future. So the first one there is about the Queensland Government's commitment to zero net emissions by 2050. The background picture is from the Paris Agreement being signed. And there are other factors like the aviation sector having committed to carbon neutral growth from 2021, which leads us to expect that they'll need to find somewhere above 2 billion tonnes of carbon offsets to achieve that ambition.
That's between now and 2035. And the other thing I would say is that the international shipping sector similarly is currently negotiating another pathway for carbon neutral growth. And in order to achieve that, they are similarly going to need to find offsets, given the long-term nature of technological transition in both of those sectors.
So carbon offsets are effectively, in an economic sense, a way of helping economies find the most efficient way to decarbonise. Yeah. So they enable agriculture to engage in these transitions as well. So ultimately, what we're proposing here, and this is the business case for Queensland's investment, I suppose, and it underpins the more enterprise-specific business cases that we might talk about further. We see carbon farming as a new commodity that landholders can engage with if it fits their plans for their property. It's entirely voluntary. There's no one insisting that people do this stuff. And it's absolutely important because of the types of longevity to these projects. We're talking about projects that can have up to a 100-year commitment involved with them, that landholders and others are happy with the outcome of carbon projects before they start down that path. But Queensland does have substantial biophysical capacity for carbon farming. It does offer income diversification for land managers, which we've seen work well in some regions where carbon farming is already well established. And it can support adaptation within production systems to increase carbon stocks in soil, for example, is generally seen as beneficial for production. And it can also help retain the licence to operate for some of our important industries, such as the red meat industry. Noting there, the Meat and Livestock Association of Australia has set itself a target of effectively carbon neutrality by 2030.
And the other final thing to say is that carbon farming is not something that is separate, it's not exclusive. Agriculture and carbon farming are not mutually exclusive. They can be part of an overall holistic plan for managing a particular agricultural undertaking. So
with that view of the Land Restoration Fund is interested in expanding Queensland carbon projects, especially where they deliver co-benefits. I now want to talk a bit about where those co-benefits are likely to be concentrated and why there's something that Queensland needs to do to achieve that end. So here I've got the contract portfolio. So the first table I showed was about the projects, how many there are and what types of methods they're using. This one's about the contracts where projects are selling carbon credits back to the Commonwealth. Queensland has 151 contracted projects, and again, they're mostly vegetation projects. The map on the right shows spatially where those projects are. So the dark brown colour, reddy brown colour, is savanna burning projects on the coast, on the Cape, and the green projects here are human-induced regeneration projects in the main, which are mostly happening in southwestern Queensland. And there's a smattering of other projects that have been developed over some of this more heavily developed parts of eastern Queensland. Now, when we look at sort of the priorities for restoration from the point of view of biodiversity maintenance or water quality for the reef and those sorts of things, and compare that with where we're seeing carbon projects, especially these regeneration projects, occurring, there's a bit of a mismatch. And part of the reason for that is that we expect that you need a higher price per carbon credit to unlock projects in those higher priority regions for biodiversity. So the map in the middle there shows which sub-regions of Queensland have low levels of remnant vegetation cover, and remnant vegetation cover is correlated with the number of species that we expect to maintain in those landscapes through time, especially with the oncoming rush of climate change. And the map on the right with the purple areas shows where ecosystems that are now considered endangered used to be. So they're the sorts of priorities that we're talking about, the Land Restoration Fund looking for co-benefits through. So we're looking for carbon projects that can help deliver increased remnant vegetation in areas that have very little remnant vegetation or increased extent of endangered ecosystems. Similarly, if we think about it at the species level, these maps are for fauna and flora, where we can expect them to find habitat. And again, they don't align particularly well with the distribution of current carbon farming projects. And the map on the right shows the catchments where we're worried about water quality for the reef. And again, there's not a strong overlap between where carbon farming activity is now, as enabled by the Commonwealth Government's focus on lowest cost abatement, and where we'd like to see it for the co-benefits that the Land Restoration Fund needs to deliver. So they're a bit of an indication of where we'd like to see carbon farming projects come forward to develop that pipeline of credit generating projects from Queensland that will deliver co-benefits, in this case the biophysical ones. So we'll leave that there. Essentially, to recap, I hope you've been convinced that carbon farming's a thing. It's underway in bits of Queensland, but there's a lot of upside, a lot of potential for expansion that will deliver benefits not just to the landholders, and most importantly, of course, the landholders that run the projects, but also to the state and our communities by the other goods that carbon farming can deliver. And that's something that we in the Land Restoration Fund are looking to support. So I'll stop sharing there, Don.
Okay. Well, Don and Megan, thanks very much for your time today. It's a huge topic to try to cover off in 20 minutes. For Wendy, who sent through a question, yes, this video will be available to you automatically after. So you'll be able to share slides with other people you might want to. So that's the good news, that it'll be available to you afterwards, so you don't have to take copious notes now. We're going from Brisbane now to Bundaberg to talk to Mark. Mark is a guy that's doing this on the ground, and so he's the other side of the coin, if you like. And so I hope we can get Mark's slides up soon.
All right, thanks, Don. I'll bring this up now. Okay, just confirm that you can see that screen. Yep, okay. So thanks for the introduction, Don, and yeah, the words that you said previously as well, Don. My name's Mark Lincoln. I'm with a company called Green Collar. We work in this area, and we're here today to talk to you further about carbon farming in Queensland and what some of those things might actually be able to mean to you. I guess the headline that I'd like to put out there for the start of this is that carbon farming is about identifying some ways where you might be able to make some additional income from your country over and above ways that you might be traditionally used to thinking about. So we're going to go through the next few minutes talking about some of the concepts behind it. And yeah, I really hope that it's of value to you. So just to understand, my name is Mark. Like I said, I'm the Queensland Business Manager of our company called Green Collar. I'm based in Bundaberg. I work all over Queensland. Green Collar is one of Australia's largest project developers for establishing environmental markets. And in this context, an environmental market means working in carbon farming. We started in 2008. We have a national approach and we have projects all over Australia. We work with graziers, farmers, traditional owners, other landholders, NRM groups to help identify potential ways to put value on their natural capital. And what do we mean by natural capital? It's things like your existing vegetation. It might be other types of resources that exist on your property as well, through the ways in which you might manage grass or livestock. So what do we actually do? So again, I'm going to come back to a key message, is that this is a business opportunity and it has some environmental benefits, but the reason why you would want to think about this is the potential in establishing that additional commercial return to how you're currently operating. And just to be really clear, and touching on what Don and Megan said, this is about an additional income. It's not to replace any of your existing income streams. Carbon farming is about working in coexistence with agriculture. The type of ways in how you might generate that income, well, I'll talk about a bit further, but essentially it's an opportunity to establish an additional background cash flow that can help in smoothing out some of the volatilities of drought, roller coasters of commodity prices, and help plan for the future. And in turn, through following some of those methodologies that have been touched on, we can achieve good outcomes for the land, our catchments, and the environment. We also sit on the board of the Carbon Market Institute, which is the peak industry body for climate change. We were a foundation signatory to the Carbon Industry Code of Conduct as well. And moving forward and looking into the future for what the carbon industry needs to do, is that it's about following a particular sets of rules that are driven by legislation and acting ethically and transparently. So what is carbon farming? It's about generating an additional income, like I said, and typically these ways are done through how you might manage your vegetation, soil or livestock. It follows some strict rules and legislation and is popular all over Queensland. So just to reinforce those strict rules, that's the methods for doing this, which Don touched about in his presentation. The unit of measure that we work in this is tonnes of what's called carbon dioxide equivalent, or in short form CO2e. And what that essentially is a measure of the warming effect of greenhouse gas. So trees filter carbon dioxide. More trees, more ability to be able to filter that. But it's also got to be in an integrated way that fits in with agriculture, like I said, and supports people on the land. There are different ways to calculate this. It's still a developing industry, and it's evolving rapidly, and it's a really exciting thing to be part of. So how do we do it? So carbon farming, you'll often hear other terms like carbon sequestration, and it's through, largely in the work that I do, is through vegetation projects with the land sector. So in particular, we focus in 2 areas, and these come down to particular methodologies. The technical name of the first one is human-induced regeneration. I'm just going to refer to it as a regeneration, or regen for short. And the second type is what's called avoided clearing. So it comes down to a fundamental threshold, and it's whether you're managing country that's below this threshold or above it. So the name of this threshold is what's called baseline forest, and following some established definitions, baseline forest is country that is 2 metres, or vegetation on country that is 2 metres in height and has achieved a minimum of 20% canopy cover. The regeneration type methodology, that's around looking at carbon farming opportunities on country that is very small. It's got native plants in the seed stock that are sitting in the topsoil, and identifying ways in how you might manage your country moving forward over a period of 25 up to 100 years to help achieve that that seed stock to hit that 2 metres and 20%. I say "and" because in a lot of parts of Queensland, of course, you can kick the dirt and watch some trees grow, and in other parts you can't. So they actually have to be together. So places like up north, where you get your guaranteed wet season, you'll always see that really exciting growth, but it's around the canopy cover in that context. And then vice versa, in some areas where the trees might be slower growing, you've got to be able to have that height over that period, following some thresholds that are identified under the methodology, and achieve that canopy cover as well. Avoided clearing is jumping to the other side of the baseline forest threshold, and if you've got country that has a history of being cleared previously, and you have the legal right to clear it, and you can identify a bit of a pattern that's happened in the past, and you've got some country that you're thinking about potentially doing it again, that's broadly the bones to an avoided clearing project. And that's about saying, well, okay, I'm not going to clear that anymore. I can live with that. You can still graze in both those scenarios. That's typically what we work under, is that regeneration and avoided clearing method here in Queensland. But the other thing that we do is we try and work to help contribute to make sure some of these methodologies always remain fit for purpose. And in the meantime, if there's new ways to look at managing carbon or going into carbon farming in Queensland, we're certainly involved in some of the developments of those new methodologies as well. So I've touched on this a couple of times, and it's a really important headline. Environmental markets, i.e. carbon farming, they're a business decision. So you have to find that right balance between, well, okay, I've got to do this. Is it actually going to be worth it to me? And it's got to have that commercial angle for it to be useful for people. So you've got to look at that cost of implementation of a carbon farming project against your opportunity cost, against, well, what can it potentially give you? You've got to look at the outcomes, and this is where we work with landholders, of what the project could deliver, and how that relates to your productivity. Like I said, it's an opportunity to potentially establish background cash flow, and in some instances can really give people a good opportunity for diversification. and earn money from their country in additional ways. So you can see I've got a bit of a diagram there. It's pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, like I said, environmental markets are a business decision. Carbon farming, it has to be worth your while. This is what the service that we provide or any other developer can provide in terms of helping to establish that commercial opportunity, because if it's not attractive to somebody on their own country, there's little incentive to do it. So it's really important to get that balance right. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of very broad examples of, well, what could this look like on a typical property. So just a couple of notes there. We're looking at average property size, say 44,000 hectares in this case. We've identified that there's potentially some eligible area, 12,000 hectares. So I guess one thing just to point out at this point, or point out, I should say, is that a carbon project doesn't have to be across your whole property. There can be over some areas and not others, and it's about a two-way street in working with landholders to help identify, okay, what could work for carbon and then what could work for a landholder, and then so's in again back to that key point, it's a business case. So some of the ways in which we assess carbon projects, well, the shortest a carbon project will go for is 25 years. The longest is typically 100. There are some things to do with, well, okay, well, how do I know if I've got a carbon project and it is actually going to be feasible, or how can we understand that as a landholder? And that's what one of the things that we do is we'll assess projects on a couple of feasibility milestones to help understand their ability to deliver the outcomes that you're forecasting over those project periods. So over a 25-year period, with carbon farming, you're essentially contracting that you're going to do some additional or different things to be able to generate that extra income as a result of making those decisions. So there's no such thing as a free lunch ultimately. And if you're going to look at a carbon project, you've got to be willing to work within the methodology to be able to identify these new opportunities and have the capacity and willingness to want to execute them as well over the life of that project. So some of the things that people might choose is around no longer doing any broad scale mechanical clearing or using chemicals through Torden or something like that, and saying, well, that's going to be my step change over that period of time. But that being said, you can still thin country. Carbon farming isn't about letting country get choked up. You absolutely can still thin it. You manage fire in a way that like you would normally to minimise your risk to yourself and your livelihood, and ultimately the additional context of a carbon project as well. Or there's other ways in which you might execute it, and that might be through how you graze your livestock. So just to paint a bit of a picture, like I said, it doesn't have to be over the whole property. Ultimately, the more country that you put to a carbon project, the better value project you're going to have, but it's got to be something that's got to suit. So just here's an example in this context. The yellowy colour you can see on this map is areas that have been identified as eligible project areas. And then the broad green areas in this case for a regeneration project are those areas that are out of scope. So just to take you through some of the examples of how this then equates to a commodity. So we've got our estimated project hectares there. Like I said, the unit of measure that we work in is tonnes of CO2e. So what we're looking at here, and that's that carbon dioxide equivalent, is that what are the modelled tonnes using an accepted method and rationale to establish this through environmental accounting of what that particular project could generate or sequester over that 10 and 25-year time frames. So what we're there, next line, we're looking at available hectares by modelled tonnes, and that gives you a couple of numbers. And then we work that out to what's your forecasted carbon sequestration over those couple of time frames, 10 years and 25. So that's 326,000 tonnes and 892,000 tonnes. Yeah, that's over those particular time periods. So here's an example of, well, okay, if I do a carbon project, well, when does the money come in? How often does it come in? Is it the same amount? And the best example is to think of your carbon income that you could get through carbon farming. Is going to pretty much follow the life cycle of a tree. Like, you're going to make a decision to do something a bit different. It's like that seed in the ground. It's probably going to be a little while before you see something, but then from years about 4 to about 11, it's going to start to, you're going to really start to see that growth. Yeah, that's where your CO2e production or your carbon sequestration will really start to produce, and then it's going to probably top out about halfway along a 25-year project, and then steadily taper out over that time period. So I'm moving quite quickly here, but just in the interest of having some good opportunities for questions at the end, I'll just run you through an example of an avoided clearing project. So again, similar sort of concepts. We've got property, there might be some suitable hectares that both work under the methodology here and also with the landholder. We've got our time periods that we work under and assess feasibility on, and then examples of your management decisions that you would incorporate for an avoided clearing project are a bit different to your regen, but that's the one where you have your country that's over that baseline forest, so you've got that mature vegetation that's been cleared in the past, and it's essentially about saying, well, I'm not going to clear that again. It's got to that height, I'm grazing it, I don't need to push it, torn it, etc. So that's the basis for me going into an avoided clearing project. There are some things that you have to be able to demonstrate in terms of past clearing activities on the land, and there is a big evidence trail that's needed to support these types of projects, because ultimately we're accountable to the Clean Energy Regulator and DES as well. So we need to be able to do these projects that are clear and transparent. So in that avoided clearing example, you can still do some thinning, but it's about always having that conscious decision, if you do, that you're maintaining that forest canopy or that vegetation above that particular threshold height, which is that baseline forest definition that I touched on. So that's a brief example of another type of project that we operate in. Again, just working through some calculations there of what does that mean. We've got some assumed project area. We've got some modelled tonnages of CO2 E that we derive, available hectares by model tonnes, can give us a broad idea of output of a project over a period of time. And then, yeah, those bottom figures are examples of some numbers which would then explain to a landholder what that can mean to them. Now, an avoided clearing project, though, is going to work quite different to a regen project. You saw the kind of bell curve shape at the start of how your carbon sequestration performed. Because you've actually grown those trees and you have that mature vegetation, what an avoided clearing project is broadly around getting paid for those trees that you've already grown versus trying to grow something over that period of time. So as a result, you're going to have a lot more of a front-loaded return on your carbon sequestration and ultimately potential ACCUs. Yeah, it is possible too to be able to combine an avoided clearing project and an HIR or a regen project on the same property, but just in different areas. So you can have those couple of different incomes from those sorts of projects that perform a bit differently, happening on the same property, but just in different areas, as long as they're suitable. Well, okay, we'll need to handbrake now. There are some limitations. Well, yeah, it's got to be right for you. It's got to be it's got to be attractive in terms of the ability to execute it, what you might make from it, and what are the actual impacts that running with a project going to do to me on a property. So you need to consider the bigger picture. So that might be things in, well, are you going to need to change your carrying capacity, for example? Some other things as well is that some people might have spent their whole life sitting on the back of a bulldozer, and yeah, the idea of walking away from that significant sunk cost of capital that they've put in already. People need to be comfortable with that, and some people aren't, and that's something that we absolutely accept. Carbon farming suits some people, but respect that it's not going to work for others, and that's where it's like any other additional diversification that you consider. It's got to be right for you. There are some constraints as well. That, remember, I said that a project's going to go for as short as 25 years or as long as 100. And the idea of that is that you're making those management commitments over that period of time where you're producing a commodity that you can't actually see or touch, but somebody else is paying for that commodity. So there has to be a lot of rigor around knowing that that's actually there. So you have to be comfortable with going through some reporting and being accountable to a regulator as part of that. You do need to consider some other things like where this may take your property in terms of succession and future interests. We do encourage people to seek their own independent financial advice, because there may be other stakeholder consents like banks that they may need to work to get as well. So that's about it from me. I hope I've given you a brief overview of what carbon farming could give you from a property perspective, following some rules. It's got to be commercially viable and something that you can do. It's a business decision for everyone, but it's a new and exciting thing. And yeah, there's a whole industry out there. So yeah, I'll wrap it up there and throw over to Don.
Thanks a lot, Mark. And again, a massive area to cover in such a short time. I have a few questions come through. Christine Bell, who I know is from Rockhampton, has asked, Christine works with the Rockhampton Council and asked, what can local governments do to encourage more carbon farming within their region? So maybe, Don, you'd like to comment on that?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Don. It's not common that I have someone else called Don on the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is just about people being aware of the existence of carbon farming, but there are also potential interactions with local government planning. So, for example, when you register a carbon farming project, the question is asked whether your project is consistent with the Natural Resource Management Body's NRM plan for your region. I know that's not a local government responsibility, but it shows an interest in how well projects fit within their context, both regulatory and community. So I'd say the first thing, especially if you're not in the southwest, like if you're around Rockhampton, it's just about awareness raising, and there's also some constraints that project proponents commonly mention when I'm talking to them, and I'd say Mark can have a similar experience. So, for example, the bank manager often has to give consent if there's a mortgage over a property and you want to do a sequestration project on that property. You need the consent of your bank. So talking to bank managers, talking to local chambers of commerce and the like about what carbon farming is, opportunities, just raising awareness, I'd say, is probably the first thing. And of course, if there are some local governments and things like regional tourism associations that are looking at generating their own offsets locally that will enable tourists to the region to buy carbon offsets to offset the impact of their flights, for example, from their destination region. So there may be land or other resources that are controlled by councils that might give them an opportunity to run their own project.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry. The next question is from Penny, and I know that Penny works with the Charters Towers region and also Cook region, and she's just inquiring whether the carbon price varies, particularly if they're close to the reef. So again, I guess that's one for you, Don.
Yeah, so currently the major buyer of carbon credits is the Emissions Reduction Fund in Canberra, and they're interested in least cost abatement. So I wouldn't expect that particular buyer to be interested in paying different prices from different regions. But from our point of view in the Land Restoration Fund, once it's established, and that's something we're going through now, and I should be clear, it's not there yet, our plan is definitely to be willing to consider higher prices for projects depending on where they are and what co-benefits we can expect them to deliver. So if you are, for example, in a priority for reduced sediment runoff for the benefit of the Great Barrier Reef, that would be something we would consider when we think about what an appropriate price per credit would be. So yes, when the Land Restoration Fund is working, we will be paying different prices for projects from different areas that are doing different activities.
So Mark, next week, the next webinar in the series is around regenerative agriculture. So I imagine that there is a fair connection between regenerative agricultural thoughts and carbon farming. So maybe you want to have a thought on that?
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. Don, there is carbon farming and regenerative agriculture might go the way for some landholders, in the sense that it could involve reducing their numbers. That, I guess, difference in what they might make is then offset by the return that they can potentially get from their carbon farming project, and the big picture benefit there is that you might not need to run your country as intensively or hard, and you might be able to achieve some more sustainability options into your business.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap this up. We're absolutely not to go over an hour, so we're coming up on 55 minutes. So I just got a few things to go through. So I want to thank Megan, Don, and Mark for being with us today and giving us some introductions to whether carbon farming might be something that suits somebody's operation. So thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I have. I've also got there some examples of projects that are being run in the regions we're working for. So there's just a few little different styles of projects. There's also some more webinars coming up in the series. As I said, the next one is on regenerative agriculture. So please look at some of these others, because I think the information flows across some of them. There's on our website, cleangrowthchoices.org, that you can look at all the past webinars, including this one will be up there soon. So on behalf of all the team who presented today and part of the Community and Transition team, I'd like to thank you all for listening and have a great week. Thanks, bye.